This is Chapter 3, Key Issue 2, Where are Migrants Distributed? Learning goals: students will be able to describe global and USA migration patterns and explain the relationship between migration patterns and the demographic transition stages. Concepts to know would be the global migration characteristics and the USA immigration patterns. There are 3 total eras, so that you would know the 3 eras and the source country of these immigrants in each of these eras. Looking at global migration patterns, if you look at this map, this is a current map that looks at net migration. Net in migration would be represented by the blue color. This is where there's more people migrating to these places than away from these places. Net out migration would be represented by the orange color, meaning these are places where people are leaving more than entering into the country. And the green is neutral. There's about the same amount of people who are leaving as are coming to those countries. So when you look at this map, you can see some patterns. You see that North America, specifically Anglo-America of Canada and the United States, is a place where they have more people coming into their countries than leaving. So there's a net in migration. You see places in especially Western Europe, Northern Europe, into Russia. Also net in migration. See Australia and New Zealand, net in migration. And then you see a few pockets of blue scattered in. In Africa, you see Libya and see some countries in southern Africa. There's Turkey. You see some countries in the Middle East here. And you see Nepal here. So if you think about, the world is divided into 2 large categories of countries, and we've talked about this before. Least developed countries are countries that tend to be poorer. They are not as culturally powerful and dominant in the world as far as setting popular trends for the rest of the world to follow. They are usually not the large decision makers in global issues, such as what to do with Syria, what to do with Israel, how do we deal with global warming and such. And these countries, these less developed countries, are called also periphery countries. Something that's on the periphery is on the edge. It's on the fringe. And because these countries tend to be less powerful economically, culturally, politically they are more on the fringe of power and dominance and influence in the world. MDCs, more developed countries, are the opposite. They are powerful politically, they're usually leaders economically, leaders culturally, as they are trendsetters for popular culture. And these countries are also called core countries. A core is at the center of something. So periphery and core in this instance is not a geographical location, it's more influence. So MDCs at the core of global influence politically, economically, culturally, not the core as in the middle of the earth. And LDCs are kind of on the fringe or the edge as far as their global influence economically, politically, culturally. So where you look at where there's net out migration, it looks like this is mostly LDCs, periphery. Think about why people would be leaving these areas. And then net in migration typically is the areas that are core countries, where there's more influence. So you can think about maybe why that would occur. Think along the lines of population explosion. Think along the lines of, reasons why people migrate. Why would they migrate? Number one reason, as far as what Rubenstein would say, is that they're looking for jobs, looking for employment. Here's another look at the global migration patterns. If you think about what the type of thematic map this would be. See that there is a symbol, it's a circle, and the larger the circle here, the greater amount of data it represents. So this is a proportional symbol map, and it also shows net migration in and out. And this is between the period of 2000 to 2005. You see the kind of the lighter green color shows where people are mostly migrating to. So again, you see Canada, United States, you see Western Europe, Russia, some pockets here and there in Africa and Asia, and then also down here in Australia. So same data, but a little different, just a different thematic map. All right, here's another map that shows, this is actually a migration flow map or migration stream map, and the size of the migration stream represents the number of people who are migrating. So if you look at this and think about where are the three largest global migration flows, look where you have the large arrows. So we have here, this is a very large arrow, and you can see this is Asia, and a lot of people are moving from Asia going to Europe. Here's another large flow, and so you see a lot of people moving from Asia, and they are going to North America, Canada, and United States. And the next biggest flow would be here, which would be a lot of people going from Latin America, from Mexico down to the tip of Argentina, moving up to North America. You see some smaller flows. You see Asians going to Australia. You see Africans going to Europe. And you see Europeans also moving to North America. So I'm going to look at another website here. And this shows maps of the world in the different regions. And if you click on, let's say click on Africa, and you see here, these, so this is migrants from Africa reside in the following world regions. So you see Africans that are migrating, they reside in Africa. So a lot of Africans are migrating within their own continent, maybe across their country border or within their own country. And then you see most Africans moving to Europe. And if you think about the gravity model, this would make sense because Africans would be migrating the shortest distance possible to an area that would have lots of economic activity, and that would be Europe, which is closer to them than the Americas. And then looking over here, this is the destination for migrants from Africa. So you see from northern Africa, the destination for these migrants, you can see the blue, which is Europe. So most of these migrants from North Africa are going to Europe or even Asia, and this would include the Middle East. And that would make sense again because the Middle East, which is Asia, Southwest Asia, and Europe is close to North Africa. Eastern Africans, you can see most of them are staying within their own African country or countries surrounding that. West Africa, again, most Africans are staying within West Africa. You can see a few going to the Americas and to Europe. And in Southern Africa, most are not actually even migrating. And you can look at some other areas. Look at Let's look at Asia. So Asia, migrants from Asia are actually still staying in Asia. So a lot of migration happening within Asia, between different countries or within countries. You see, not a lot of Asians are going to Africa, but there are a lot of Asians going to Americas and Europe. And then not quite as many to Oceania. And then looking here, let's look at South Central Asia. Now South Central Asia would be like the Middle East and Afghanistan and stuff like that. A lot of them are staying in Asia. Some are going to the Americas, some to Europe. Western Asia, which would be the Middle East, you can see a lot staying within Asia, you see the green, but then a larger percentage going to Europe. So the closer, these areas are closer to Europe, so you would likely see more migrants going to Europe because it's close. And again, there is no evidence here of any migrants from Asia going to Africa. They're going to be looking for jobs, and you're probably not going to find as many jobs in Africa. Let's just look one more. Let's look at Europe. So when you look at Europe, most Europeans are actually traveling within Europe. A little bit going to Asia and Americas, but again, none going to Africa. And then you look at within these regions, look at Eastern Europe, a lot of Eastern Europeans moving within Europe, largely to West Europe. You think Southern Europe, moving to other places in Europe, Western Europe, and so forth. So a lot of them are staying within their own region, but traveling maybe to different countries or within their own country. All right, let's go back to looking at global patterns again. All right, actually we're going to move on to migration to the United States. So you saw something like this in your book, and when you come into class you will be doing matching the source countries that came to the United States and where did they come from in each of these different peaks of migration. So colonial time, which would be in the 1700s, 18th century, and then the 19th century, which is the 1800s. There's three peaks. This first peak here in the mid-1800s, second peak around 1880, and the third peak kind of the turn of the century into the early 1900s. And then there would be another peak, third era from places to the United States since the 1950s to present. So as you're reading, be mindful of what these different eras were. Colonial, like I said before, 1900s, and 20th century. Right. As we look at the reason for migration to the United States, especially from Europe during these time periods, and these would be the three different peaks of migration, I want you to be mindful of this map that shows the spread of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution started in the United Kingdom, right here. Started in the 1700s. And from the United Kingdom, this Industrial Revolution of technology, innovation, medical innovation, this spread from this northwestern country in Europe. It spread eastward and southward, so that these countries, as these waves from UK, from the northwest to the south and to the east, they also experienced their Industrial Revolution. This will affect migration. If you think about how does the Industrial Revolution affect the demographic transition stages that a country goes through in Europe, this will have a huge impact on migration. We know that the Industrial Revolution caused European countries to enter into their stage 2 demographic transition stage. That's when crude birth rate was high and crude death rate dropped because of innovation, especially with medical practices, immunization, sanitation, and so forth. So it allowed people to live longer, and there was a population explosion. If you think about the population explosion in a country becoming really crowded, this will influence migration. So migration would, with the crowded population in a country, people would want to leave their country and go elsewhere because of the overcrowdedness, the inability to get a job because there's just so many people competing for a job. And so this spread of the Industrial Revolution has influenced the migration from Europe. And specifically in this section, we're talking about to the United States. So let's look at the different eras of migration to the United States, keeping in mind this spread of Industrial Revolution during this era of 1800s, also called the 19th century. All right, so the first era of migration to the United States would be the Colonial Era. This is during the 18th century, which are the 1700s. Two groups of people migrated to the United States. One were the slaves that were forced to migrate from Africa. So this was not their choice. They were brought to the United States by European and American slave masters who went there seeking slaves to work in plantations in the United States. We're talking about U.S. United States working on cotton plantations and tobacco. African slaves did also go to the Caribbean and Latin America. Another group of people that came to the United States during this colonial era were Europeans, mostly British. This was during their Industrial Revolution, and so people were voluntarily migrating to the United States looking for jobs. It was very crowded, and there was competition because of the growth in population due to the Industrial Revolution. So they were leaving to get for jobs. There was religious freedom as the Pilgrims were escaping persecution, and again, just escaping overcrowdedness. So this is the first era of U.S. migration, Colonial Era. African slaves forced to migrate, and British who were escaping this overcrowded country because of the Industrial Revolution, looking for economic advancement. The second era of migration to the United States would be during the 19th century, which is the 1800s. And again, as you look at the spread of the Industrial Revolution, these three peaks of migration coincide with this spread of Industrial Revolution. So the first peak you see is the mid-1800s, 1840 to 1850. So we look at here, 1840s and 1850, we're looking at countries in northwest Europe. So Ireland would be this, and then also we have Germans coming during this time too. So Ireland, including the British and Germany, came during this time, escaping political unrest, poor economic conditions. The Irish were coming because at one time there was a potato famine during this time, and they were starving to death, so a lot of them went to the United States looking for places to farm. And then as this spread of Industrial Revolution, the next group would be during the 1800s. This also is in North and Western Europe. So we have Germany, 1/3 of the migrants during this time, and Irish, but also we've added Norway and Sweden. These are the countries up here in the Scandinavian countries, North Europe. So this is again during their Industrial Revolution. Men were looking for work. There was a shortage of land because of crowdedness. And then as the wave of Industrial Revolution spread even further south, we see people from Europe coming during this last peak, the end of the 19th century, kind of moving into the 20th century, early 1900s. We see people coming from South and East Europe. Italians, Russians, Austria-Hungary, Czech, Poland, Romanian, etc. So the spread goes from northwest. So we have northwest and northwest Europeans in the first two peaks, with adding the Scandinavian countries in the second peak. And then you have South and Eastern Europeans in the last peak of the 19th century. Then, following the World War II, you have to think about what areas of the world was there a population explosion after World War II, and how would this relate to the demographic transition model. So this is kind of a funny looking map. It's really a cartogram, kind of silly, but the size of the country represents the size of the population. So this is post-World War II. So if you look at the countries that are very, very crowded, you see this country here, which is India. This green country here is China. And then you see this country here, Japan. And so you've got this population explosion after World War II because of the medical revolution. And this population explosion is going to, this overcrowdiness in the country is going to result in migration away from these areas. So Asia is a very largely populated, and a lot of Asians came to the United States during this time after World War II. But we also see a lot of people coming from Latin America, including Mexico, to the United States. Largely Mexicans, which is real close, just over the border. El Salvador, Cuba, Haiti, and so forth. You can see the size of the migration stream represents the number of migrants that moved. So, when we look at the 20th century, these migrations come from LDCs, mostly Asia and Latin America. And there was a declining European population. So if you think about it, 1950 is around when Asians and Latin Americans were entering their second demographic transition stage, where they had a population explosion, and that would affect migration out of their regions. Asians, we have mostly a lot of Chinese and Indians coming, and then the Philippines, this mostly first, and then later, 1980s, 1990s, Philippines, Vietnamese, people from South Korea, Latin America, Mexico, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Cuba, Haiti, and there were a lot of Germans who came during the European time, but now Mexico has surpassed Germany for most migrants in 2006. In 1986, there was this Immigration Reform and Control Act, which allowed immigrants in the United States, whether they were illegal or not, to be admitted as legal immigrants. And so during 1990, which would be after this act was passed, several 100,000 became legal citizens in the United States. In 1991, 1.8 million became legal immigrants. So I want to look at this website that shows where the foreign-born immigrants are living in the United States. So this map looks similar to the map that we saw, the chart that we saw in your book. It starts at 1900, so this would be our third peak of European immigrants during the early 1900s, turn of the century. And then you see a decline in European, and decline in in population, in immigration altogether. And then you see in the latter part of the 1900s, you see a large portion of our immigrants coming from Latin America and also Asia. So over the time, in 1920, these are the foreign newcomers. Where did they settle? Mostly Europeans, and then you have Latin Americans along the border of Mexico. That would make sense because as far as gravity model, people would travel the least distance possible. And in 1950, still the same pattern. You see North Americans coming here in the tip, and those would be people coming from Canada. And then you can see Latin America has expanded to California included, and also Florida. And then the most recent, we now see mostly Latin Americans across the United States. We have Asian represented with the orange color here. Here's Europeans, and then you have Canadians. This map is really interesting. This is the same kind of thing, but looking more detail. This is a map at the data aggregate level of the county, and you can look at what the foreign-born in each county. The reddish color is Latin America. You can see green is Canada, purple is Western Europe, the orange is Asia, Russia and Eastern Europe is blue, and then Africa pink. And this is interesting because you can look back at the 1800s, go all the way back, and you would expect to see mostly Western European immigrants. This is during the North and West, the second peak during the 1900s. So most of them are from Western Europe. And as you move here, still Western Europe, but now we're seeing a lot more blue, which would be the Russia and Eastern Europe. So you see an increased population in your Eastern European immigrants. And then as you move through, still mostly Europeans, you see a few Latin Americans in the Southwest. And then 1920, again, a little bit more. And then what's interesting between 1920 and 1930 is that in 1920 there were some quota laws passed. And the quota laws passed in the 1920s were that the people who were allowed to immigrate into the country had to be reflective of the people who are already living in the country. So if there are mostly European people living in the country, let's say you have maybe 40% people in the United States were German. That means that 40% of the immigrants that came into the country would have to be German. So because most of the immigrants in the United States in 1920 were European, and these quota laws, then when you look at 1930, most of the people who were in the country then were European, reflecting the population in 1920. It's very possible, because we do see Hispanic population in the Southwest area, that these were possibly not legal immigrants, so they would not be counted in that number. And then as you move toward 1950 and 1960, the immigration laws changed, and it did not reflect the 1920s anymore. And then as you see going to 1970, you start seeing a growing population of Hispanic, and you can see more orange color Asians. And so this is what it looks more like today. All right, so that concludes looking at global patterns of migration. Be mindful of the demographic transition. and then also patterns of migration to the United States.